I'm here with Luc Beaudoin, president of Cogsus and adjunct professor of education at Simon Fraser University, based in British Columbia, Canada. Luc is currently running the Cognitive Productivity Research Project at Simon Fraser, investigating psychological questions regarding knowledge worker cognitive productivity. Luc has a PhD in cognitive science from the University of Birmingham, where he conducted research on computer modeling of goal processing and motivation. Over the course of his career, Luc has held a number of positions in many very different fields. For example, he worked as a technical writer for Tundra Semiconductor, as a senior software developer for Abatis Systems Corp., and he was assistant professor of military psychology and leadership at the Royal Military College of Canada. Luc is the author of numerous scientific publications on a wide range of problems in cognitive science. One of his most recent publications is his Leanpub book, Cognitive Productivity, The Art and Science of Using Knowledge to Become Profoundly Effective. In this interview, we're going to talk about Luc's research interests and his book, and about his experiences using Leanpub. We'll also talk about ways we can improve Leanpub for him and for other scientific and academic authors. So thank you, Luc, for being on the Lean Publishing podcast.
It's my pleasure.
Just to start out, can you tell me a little bit about how you first became interested in cognitive science?
Oh, we're going back.
Yeah.
1980s. I was a psychology student, and I was my career path was to become a clinical psychologist, and I was taking a neuroscience course. And that had me broadening my horizons a little bit, as university does to students. And I was very interested in neuroscience with this course that I was taking, and I worked in a neuroscience lab. We were studying the neural basis of motivation and reward. And so that basically opened me up to all kinds of possibilities. And I took a philosophy course, an epistemology course. It was a requirement at the University of Ottawa. And there I discovered cognitive science, and that really intrigued me. So cognitive science is basically the study of the human mind, and the kind of reference model that we use for that, or the way of thinking that we use, is information processing. So it's not that the human mind is a digital computer, but that it's a device that could be understood as something that processes information. And I thought that was very interesting. It's also it's an approach to the human mind that recognizes that the human mind is too complicated to be studied just from one perspective. So there's no one discipline that's constitutive of cognitive science that kind of owns cognitive science. So we often think of psychology as being that which studies the human mind, but actually there's many contributing disciplines to this cognitive science thing. So there's artificial intelligence, there's philosophy, linguistics, and other disciplines. Neuroscience contributes as well. So, anyways, to make a long story short, I just fell in love with the idea, and there was a professor there called Claude Lamontagne. He was just an amazing professor, and I was told, Luc, you have to take Professor Lamontagne's course on perception. So I was going to take cognition, and I took perception in addition to that. So beyond the requirements, I took that course, and I guess they knew that he and I would really hit it off, which we did. And he has a tendency to blow people's minds, and he did with mine, and he basically convinced me that this was the way to understand the human mind, is basically using information processing as a kind of metaphor.
Speaking of the connection between cognitive science and psychology, you've mentioned online that your PhD thesis and your honors thesis diverged from empirical psychology's approach to the issues you addressed in your theses.
That's right.
And you instead used a designer approach.
That's right.
Can you explain what you mean by a designer approach?
Okay, so the idea is that if we're to understand the human mind with this approach, basically we have to kind of, in a sense, reverse engineer it. So we think of what are the requirements that this system kind of implements, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't look at the entire human mind. Some of us do look at the big architecture of the human mind, but typically people focus on perception or linguistic processing, and usually some very specific aspect thereof. But basically, we proceed as engineers would, to basically understand first what are the requirements of a system, and then we propose and designs to implement. To satisfy those requirements. And then we move on beyond that to developing computer programs that implement those designs. And then we actually press the run button, the compile button, and the run button, and find out, well, you know what, this doesn't exactly do what I thought it would. Actually, it doesn't compile. Or more typically is you don't even get to the point of being able to write your program, because what this does is it exposes gaps in your understanding. But, you move along and you do try to run these simulations, and then you can actually test your predictions in one way or another using your computer program. So, and then what you do is you study the relations between these different levels. So by going through this whole process, you find out that, well, you maybe didn't understand the requirements properly. So you have to, you have to study that in more detail. Your design wasn't right. And so on. So this is basically, it's an engineering stance, which involves some reverse engineering, to understanding the human mind. So I had, coincidentally, I'd taken a psychological assessment in my first year of university in psychology, and they said, did you ever consider being an engineer? And I thought, well, what are you talking about? I'm in psychology. What are you talking about? I want to do therapy and understand the mind. Well, then basically later I realized that this psychologist was spot on, but I just didn't know it was possible to study the human mind using engineering methods.
That's fascinating. Is that still something that you carry on with you in your work for the Cognitive Productivity Research Project?
Yes, if you read my book, you'll see that that I do delve into that. And as a matter of fact, I think it's kind of generally useful for people to have a working model of themselves and each other, and to think of the components of ourselves and what they do. So it helps us understand, all kinds of things, our emotions, each other's emotions, how people respond, etc. So we kind of have to do this anyway. Whatever reference model we use, we have to think about ourselves and our behavior and what implements it, right? And but cognitive science gives you a way of some new concepts to think about ourselves and to think about each other. And it's a point I make in the book, basically, is that natural language has provided us with concepts and ways of thinking about psychology, and that's called folk psychology, and it works very well most of the time, but there's all kinds of limiting cases. And if you want to go beyond that, then you enter into the realm of cognitive science. Yeah, and
actually, I wanted to talk about your book later on, so I'll ask you some questions about that specifically, and when you talk about some of people's misperceptions about impacts that technology can have on the mind. But before we do that, can I ask you a little bit about what Cogsus does and the story of how you founded it?
Sure. Cogsus is an ambitious enterprise. The project actually started in 2002. It had a different name, but I had basically switched domains many times. And you always bring some knowledge with you when you switch domains, but you also have to do a lot of learning. So as you mentioned, I started in psychology, then I was doing artificial intelligence for my PhD, cognitive science, and then I was teaching psychology at the military college with some courses that I hadn't even taken myself, so I kind of had to come up to speed quite quickly on that. And that happens. That's typical for a professor to do that. And then I've worked as a technical writer and all these different things. So I'd gone through this very intense series of learning cycles, and culminating at Abatis, which was where I was the first employee, and we set up this company, and we had very ambitious objectives for it, and we were all just learning lots of stuff. I was the person probably had to learn the most in the early days because of my background being different. They wanted somebody who was a startup, more of a startup expert, because I had done a startup before, so I've proven I can work on multiple, in different parts of the business. So I was actually the first, and I had to learn about internet protocol and routers and all these things. I had to basically absorb lots of specifications, IETF documents, Internet Engineering Task Force documents. And those, for a lot of people, including myself, that was new. It was new stuff at the time, right? The RFCs. So I had to absorb this, as did other people. And it just occurred to me that the technology wasn't really supporting us in the learning we had to do. We had these specs, and we'd print them out. So the printer was very, very busy at Abatis. And people, although the founders had ensured that we had the best technology, we had very fast computers, and we had the best monitors available, CRTs in those days, right? But still, we'd print out these documents, and we'd highlight them and mark them up. And so it occurred to me as I was going through my learning process at Abatis that, somehow there's something wrong with the browsers and PDF readers, that they're not supporting our learning if we're printing.
Right.
So I thought to myself, there's got to be a better way. And obviously, from having a cognitive science background, I had some ideas about what those ways might be. And so after Abatis was acquired, and as things go, our parent company started to implode. So I started thinking about what to do next, and I had a lot of projects in mind. And the one that appealed to me the most was basically bringing together cognitive science and technology to solve the problem of basically helping people learn with cognitive science and with technology. So my goal was to develop, it was to understand, first of all, what would be required. Again, the engineering approach, right? Well,
right.
What would technology look like to better support our learning as experts now? So I wasn't looking at children's learning and high school learning. My interest since 2002 has mainly been, or 2001, has mainly been adult learning, thinking that we can then go back and help students with that. I think that's true. So how can we help experts at the top of their game learn? So I wrote some specs and so on, and I started a business. I was writing a business plan, all kinds of functional specs, that kind of stuff. And then I met a professor called Phil Winnie, who was studying self-regulated learning from a psychology perspective, educational psychology perspective. And he had done a software project before, and he wanted to continue doing that. Oh, he was doing another one at the time, so he basically invited me to join him. So we decided to join forces, and I brought the CogSci Plus technology. He had the educational psychology and had done some technology work as well, and we had business aspirations, so we decided to work together, and that we did, and we spent up to the end of 2009 working together on various products which did part of this.
Okay.
That's the story.
Okay, no, it's great. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Startup life is fun.
Yeah.
I've got, actually, speaking of fun, I was looking over your list of publications, and I can see that you've co-authored the introduction to a forthcoming book called From Animals to Robots and Back, Reflections on Hard Problems in the Study of Cognition. That's just a fascinating title. Can you explain a little bit about what the book's about? Okay,
well, what that's about, actually, I think the way I put it is that I've been invited to co-author, but I haven't actually written that document yet. I'm co-authoring, is the idea here. What's going on here is a volume of papers for Professor Aaron Sloman, who's had his Festschrift, which is a celebratory conference, and a book being prepared for him in 2011. So he was my PhD thesis supervisor at the University of Birmingham, where I did my PhD. So we basically decided that this warranted a book, and the book is a collection of papers from his various students and people who worked with him, etc. So what I've got is a paper on. I've got a paper that the title of which is I can give you. I think it's on the website, which is basically explores learning in learning with technology. So the project that I'm currently on.
Okay, you've also written about supersomnolent mentation.
I picked up on that.
Yeah. I mean, I had a lot of fun reading your list of publications and just thinking about. So I did read a little bit of it, but can you explain a little bit about what supersomnolent mentation is?
Well, funny you should ask. Well, okay. So again, this is you can think of this as a proof of concept for cognitive science. So the problem that I address in that paper is reducing sleep onset latency. So many of us have limited contact time with our beds, whether we've got insomnia or not. Let's say you've got 7 hours in bed, or you give yourself 7.5 hours. Well, let's say you need 7 or 7.5 hours. So in order to get enough sleep, you basically have to sleep all the while that you're in bed. Well, typically it takes people, 15 minutes, sometimes 45 minutes or more to fall asleep. So the problem I've been addressing, one of the kind of my background problems over 20 years, is how could we reduce that sleep onset latency? And I think I found a way.
Great news.
Yes, because it's not just the initial sleep onset that's the problem. Is if by the time you get 35 or something, you're waking up in the middle of the night, and then you've got to go to sleep. So then you've got to go through this cycle twice. So I thought, well, this is a really interesting problem. Let's solve it. To make a long story short, I developed this theory, which basically said that if I could get people into a state that's very much like the mental state that they're in as they fall asleep successfully, right? Might be part way to helping them actually fall asleep. So that was one part of it. That's kind of one angle on it. The other thing was to basically I distinguish between different kinds of thinking that happen at sleep onset. Or that can happen at any time, basically. So I distinguish between asomnolent thinking. So somnolence has to do with falling asleep.
Right.
So asomnolent basically means that's neutral to sleep. Often we have kind of insomnolent mentation, right? So insomnolent is the kind of stuff that keeps you up. So this is what most of the psychology techniques aim to help you deal with, basically. If you're going to sleep and thinking about problems or problem solving, planning, etc., that's inconsistent with falling asleep. That's
so overcoming a negative thing that's preventing you from getting what you want.
Yeah. So that would be to overcome that is counter insomnolent, right?
Right.
So most of the psychology deals with counter insomnolent stuff. So I thought, well, really, if we want to do something which is better, let's combine the counter insomnolent with something that actually takes you over the edge. Because let's say take meditation, for instance. So that's a technique that's sometimes advocated for helping people fall asleep. Now, meditation, actually, if done right, does not put you over the edge into sleep. It actually is a very focused state. You're alert. You're not supposed to fall asleep if you do it well. So, but it does deal with the insomnolent mentation. If you're doing it well, you're not bothered by by these insomnolent thoughts. So I propose that there's certain features of somnolent mentation that really take you over the edge, and that that involves basically having very disjointed thoughts and imaginings going on. So your mind, and as a matter of fact, if you wake somebody up who's falling asleep, you'll find that they're having kind of these random memories and images and thoughts. Mm-hmm. So now the trick is to get people to into that state, and that's one of the things I think I cracked with that paper. And we're actually working on a little product that implements that.
Oh, fascinating!
That helps people implement that, and that's going to be out very soon.
Speaking of disjointed thoughts, I'd just like to return to your book.
Yes.
You were sorry for having changed the subject abruptly, but you were bumping up against something, a great quote I found in your book that I wanted to ask you about, which is where in near the beginning you talk about public epistemic overexuberance. Maybe you don't remember that line, but I really liked it. You're talking about Steven Pinker and claims about how the internet can rewire our brains by Nicholas Carr.
Hey, that's pretty good. You found that in the footnote.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. I think that sometimes there's people get a little bit excited about neuroscience, and I think neuroscience is great. It's something to get excited about, but we sometimes get overexcited, and we lose sight of the way progress happens for the most part. I think in cognitive science. So, if there's a lot of people are kind of pushing, brain-based education and that kind of concept, and they're not being called on it very often. So I thought my book basically does a bit of calling, right, and saying, look, it's very difficult. I mean, there's some things you can do at the brain level to, take some barriers out of education. There's no doubt about it. But I think it's important to separate levels, just as we do with computers. We have a very, the computer metaphor is really powerful, and I think it's used at a high level, but it's often not exploited as much as it should be. Because in computer science, you have very clear ideas of what levels you're operating with. There's the TCP/IP, right, stack. It's a very clear collection of levels. So in psychology, sometimes that gets blurred a little bit. So, you can do things to improve your brain, like exercising is absolutely, it's very important. It's critical for brain health, right? And nutrition, but those are fairly indirect. So they give you some enablers, but the information processing level is different nonetheless. So that's, I think, what I'm getting at there.
Yeah, it's very, very timely. There was a great article in the New York Review of Books a couple of months ago, a review by Colin McGinn of a book by a French neuroscientist who was sort of moving into the philosophical realm more than McGinn believed he should. It's discussing exactly this. And I just wanted to draw your attention. There's a fascinating exchange between them in the letters section of the latest issue where they talk precisely about what you're talking about.
Great.
Yeah, it's actually funny to see the contrast between the neuroscientist and the philosopher who's sort of calling him on a lot of these claims. And that's one of the reasons that the epistemic overexuberance, which would perhaps apply not only to the public but also to neuroscientists themselves often.
Right. So and without wanting to, this not being critical of anybody in particular, I worked very hard on that footnote because one has to be careful what one says, But that the quote I have by Pinker there, I think he's just got a great quote. I invite people to read the book just to get Pinker's quote. So on the broader subject of the book, you talk about meta effectiveness. Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually, that's really what the book's about.
Okay.
So meta effectiveness is basically a matter of becoming more effective at becoming effective. So essentially, the main problem that I address in this book is how do we become more effective at taking information on the input side, right? So a knowledge resource, I refer to them as knowledge resources. It could be a book, podcast, a lecture. It could be any kind of. It could be any piece of information that has conceptual artifacts in it. So ideas that are packaged up by somebody to help us learn something, right? So that's the input side. And how do we use that information to get to the other side? Well, what is the other side? We've got to specify. Again, if we're looking at requirements here, we've got to think of, well, what are we after? So we're after, often we just want to be able to remember something or want to be able to develop some understanding of the thing, or you want to develop a skill, if it's a programming skill or whatever. And you want to be able to apply it when the time comes, etc. So in the book, I look at these different outcomes basically, and I ask myself, well, how do we connect the input side to the output side? So that's really a problem that we face when we pick up a knowledge resource. Now, when we're using knowledge resources, we often just want to to solve an immediate problem with them, with that knowledge resource. So it's not as if we always want to use knowledge to become more effective, in general, or disconnected from the resource, right? But sometimes we do, and we call that learning. Learning is kind of it's a word that's used for all kinds of things, including this problem of say developing understanding from information that we read. So the book really says. It poses this meta-effectiveness problem. How do we become better at becoming effective? Okay.
So, and can you give us an example of one of the? I don't want to give away the whole book, but,
sure.
But maybe one of the techniques or tools for achieving better meta-effectiveness might be.
Okay. Well, sure. The book deals with a lot of the processing of the problems we face, just processing information, and that's like if you look. I should maybe say something about the structure of the book in order to
Sure.
put this into some context for people who are listening, is that the book, in the first part, we characterize the problem, including this problem of meta-effectiveness, right, and the roadblocks that we face in solving this problem. In the second part of the book, I deal with the science that I think is most relevant to this problem, and in the third part, I deal with applications, basically with there's all kinds of concepts and tips and workflows and solutions for using information to become more effective.
Okay.
And in the last two chapters, I really focus in on the problem of applying and sometimes remembering information. And that I developed a concept there called productive practice, and it's basically an extension of some important concepts and findings in cognitive science have to do with the importance of testing ourselves in learning. That's called test-enhanced learning. And then there's this concept of deliberate practice. So if you look at experts in performance disciplines, like a pianist or a golfer, so an athlete or a musician or some artist that performs for the public, they do a lot of practicing, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's basically it's understood to be it's essential basically for expert performance. Now, knowledge workers also practice in their own ways, but it doesn't tend to be as systematic. As students, a lot of us use practice, right? Or current students use practice as a way of learning. So they test themselves. They might read a chapter and then write down the questions that they need to be able to answer without reference to the material in order to have mastered that material, right? Mm-hmm. So, and then they test themselves on that. That's actually quite a good way of learning content, right? Mm-hmm. And learning all kinds of things, developing skills as well.
That's a very great connection between something we're familiar with, which is practicing for sports or things we do with our bodies, but don't necessarily think often about doing with matters of the mind. That's right.
Yeah, but again, as students do this, and they kind of have to. Mm-hmm. A lot of it's not that everyone. There are studies on this, and about 30% of the students test themselves systematically as part of their way of learning. Okay. But student learning. One of the things I draw attention to is that student learning is different from knowledge worker learning. For instance, students become very skilled at figuring out what's going to be on the exam, what am I going to be tested on, etc. And then they adjust a lot of their mental work towards those aims, and that's great. It's good if you can, as a student, also think beyond that. And there's ways of doing that, of learning to get you down the long haul. But that's a different story. So many students will learn these tricks and then graduate, but then practice kind of drops out of it. It's not that it drops out of it. We still practice. For instance, if you're given a presentation, you may very well rehearse it. If you're learning a computer programming language, you might do a whole bunch of practicing in order to build up your skills, etc. But for the most part, we don't have a very systematic way of practicing as knowledge workers. And there's many reasons for that. One is that, there's a lot of information to learn. Another is, so what do you practice? Another problem is that there's, the tests of life are kind of flash exams. They're implicit. You don't exactly know when they're going to come, how they're going to come, etc. And another problem is that it seems to me that the tool developers haven't really made the connection that I'm trying to explain in this book, which is that to master information and to master stuff, you really do need to practice, and systematic practice can be very beneficial. So this is one of the things I kind of realized in 2001 and 2 is that, we still don't have these tools to help to test ourselves on what we're learning. And I had previously developed tools on this for this, like in 1991, 92, in Smalltalk. I had developed my first tools because I fell upon this kind of way of learning in the 1980s. I realized it was quite potent. So to make a long story short, if you could find a way to test yourself on key information, which I call knowledge gems, as you're learning, then that could be very useful. One of the reasons why it's useful is that it changes your way of looking at a document. So all of a sudden you're looking for knowledge gems. You're saying, okay, what do I want to do with the information? Is there something in this document that is so useful that I could actually become a better person with this information? I could become, I could solve all kinds of problems on the fly with this information, or I can avoid problems, right? Mm-hmm. And I give some very potent examples, I think, from other researchers of things that, it really helps to know these things. So it makes it focus on these knowledge gems, and then it gives you a way of exploiting these knowledge gems.
On the subject of making,
Yeah, and that's through practice. So to fully answer your question, I have to say, well, basically practicing with yourself with challenges is the way to do it. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say on the subject of making better tools and people who are making them, you've got a tantalizing little story in your book about how you once wrote a white paper for Steve Jobs on how Apple could better support cognitive productivity in its products.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, what happened was, because I had been working in this space for a long time, the space of using technology to learn, we all knew that in approaching 2010, we all knew that Apple was working on a tablet. That was no secret. And of course, we were all speculating on what would it be. So I thought, well, I've been thinking about this for a long time. I think I should document what I think it should be, right? Mm-hmm. So I was interacting with folks at Sharp Brains, and now I proposed, or they proposed a paper. So I said, why don't, or something on the iPad, and I said, well, I can do a piece on, what the iPad should have to support. I think at the time I pitched in terms of cognitive fitness, which actually ended up being titled brain fitness, which contradicts what I'm saying in terms of the levels. So I felt uncomfortable about that title for a while. But anyway, but it was really about cognitive productivity. So I wrote a paper, something for Sharp Brains, and that's publicly available, saying, here's some things that I'd love to see in the iPad. But and then when the iPad came out, it blew my mind. I was really impressed. But I thought, still some things missing. So I wrote a review of the iPad in light of what I had previously written. So I said, look, it's got a lot here, but here's some things that are still missing. And basically what I felt in a nutshell was that, the iPad as a platform, just taking the iOS basically. So it wasn't even called iOS in those days, right? Taking the iOS, the iPhone operating system and slapping it onto a bigger device. That just blew my mind. That's so beautiful. And I thought, well, you can do tons with this. But, it still hasn't been done. So I then said, well, I can keep trying to do this myself, or I can go to the top here. So I offered some kind of collaboration with Steve Jobs, and including a white paper. And he wrote me back and said, sure, send me a white paper on it.
Great.
And I thought, that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And I knew, people knew basically, if you're in the Apple world in those days, you'd know that occasionally Steve Jobs would answer people he didn't know, right? And it's explained in his biography why he would do that. He had the similar experience in the 70s of being on the asking end. So I spent the most exhilarating week of my life writing a pretty hefty white paper for Steve Jobs, basically collecting a lot of my thoughts from the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I did that.
Great.
But that's not a public document, so I'm not. That's not going to go public. But I decided after he passed away, with different stories coming out and how he approached innovation, that I thought, well, this is a story that's worth sharing. I'm not making a big deal about it, but it's a nice little anecdote. And it speaks to a beautiful aspect of Steve Jobs, that he would accept to interact in this way with some person that he didn't even know.
Yeah, that's a great thing to do. Actually, you mentioned some things are public and some of your writings aren't. So that's a great segue into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is academic publishing. So we've seen a couple of authors publish their PhD and master's theses on Leanpub, but I'm quite sure yours is the first original book-length academic work. What are your thoughts on self-publishing and academic writing?
What are my thoughts? Well, that's a fairly general question.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a way to put it more precisely.
Yes, okay.
So I guess I could say, do you think that self-publishing is compatible with the traditional practice of academic publishing?
I think it really is a way forward for academics to do. I think it's a very significant way forward for academics to do their work. And let's face it, the open access, for instance, it's not exactly the same as open access, right? Self-publishing and open access are not the same, but there's some parallels and they can intersect, right? Particularly with Leanpub, there's no obligation. I don't think that, the books can be free on Leanpub, right?
Yes.
But I take the question in terms of, in particular, what Leanpub offers, which is to develop important ideas in print, in important documents, and to publish them as you're developing them, which I think a lot of strong thinkers should be doing anyway. Right. And there are some. I think of Aaron Sloman. He's my PhD thesis supervisor. If you look at his website, he's got these presentations and these documents that he iterates. So it's the same ideas, but they're developing over time. You track his thinking; it's developing over time. So he's got these different documents, and you can trace their lineage, right? And there's no that's what a lot of people are doing, and that's great. But it's nice to be supported with a structure like Leanpub that in which it's basically understood that this is what's going on here, is that people are putting their ideas in progress on a particular site, and they can receive feedback and update their documents with feedback from their peers or from anybody out there. So it puts you in a mindset basically of thinking lean, which is start small, iterate, and get feedback, right? And continuously improve your work. So, and if you look at what academics often do anyway, there's a lot of rehashing that happens. Sometimes it's the same idea being expressed in different terms, or for different, for different publisher or whatever. Mm-hmm. But often there's progress. So Leanpub, something like Leanpub, I think is really opens the door for academics to do this idea development in open, honest, transparent fashion.
I've often encountered a stark contrast between the typical reactions of humanities professors and scientists on the subject of in-progress self-publishing. Can you tell me about the reaction you've had from your colleagues when you tell them about your Leanpub book?
Actually, so far, not. I can't say that there's been a negative or positive response. There hasn't even been a big response so far. Yes, some people said it's got to go through. If you want to be recognized, then you should put it through go to a tier one, go to a decent publisher and get it published through there. But hey, guess what? I'm an adjunct prof. I'm not out there for recognition.
Right.
But and you know what? Maybe that's important for the progress of science as well. Mm-hmm. But this book, while it has a lot of practical information, there's a core scientific piece. So this book is really proposing some new ideas as well. And I mean, that aspect of things is not something that's I've ever been too troubled about. So I'm not a career publisher. So that's not a big deal for me.
Okay.
But I think, a professor often will need to, or somebody who wants to get on the tenure track probably, they're going to be sensitive to those concerns.
Right.
But one can also do parallel processing, right? Mm-hmm. So to self-publish is not necessarily an impediment to doing another work using the traditional ways. And as you mentioned, you mentioned in your publications on Leanpub site, there's nothing in principle stopping someone from publishing their books with a regular publisher after they've published it on Leanpub.
Yeah, that's actually one of our hopes, that people will do that, and that publishers will start to see in-progress publishing that way, so that instead of sort of passively waiting to be approached by agents or people submitting manuscripts or proposals for manuscripts, they'll actually go hunting. Yeah.
I think that the publishing industry is facing very significant challenges, and what's going to happen is basically a process of of economic natural selection, right? Like there's going to be some publishers who are going to realize, well, doing this Leanpub way is really good, so let's find a way to work with Leanpub authors. And this is actually a great way to, to vet work and to get some good content to publish. So I think the publishing industry, and you're a great example of this, is in transformation. And those publishers, I mean, there will be some kind of more dinosaur-like publishers who will survive for a long time, but there's a lot of pressure, and I think that some of the publishers who are not adapting properly will have difficulty. For instance, one of my big problems I have is with platforms like Amazon and the iPad, even publishing for the iBookstore. It's that I think of Kindle as an information jail, right? It's so difficult to get information in and out of a Kindle book as a reader, and that's a big problem. So in my book, I talk about how one could learn with PDF readers, and you can see that reading with a great PDF reader is a superior experience compared to reading with say Kindle. To be fair, Amazon has improved Kindle, right? But it's still a jail. There's, for instance, in one of the techniques that I propose is to mark up a PDF file as you're reading to indicate to tag basically the key concepts, say if that's what you're after, or the important thing, important information. That's kind of different. Key concept versus important information versus say your knowledge gaps, things you don't understand. Those are three kinds of things that from an educational perspective, there's no doubt it's very important to do that, right? So you go through your file, your document, you can actually mark things up that way. And then when it comes time to review or take action on a document, you've marked it up. So you can go and you can quickly list, say with a PDF reader called Skim, you can quickly list a document using the techniques I described, and then to pull out your knowledge gaps. Well, what's the difference between an A student and a B student after they've read a chapter of a physics book in grade 10, for example? Well, if you quiz the grade 10 student on that chapter, these two grade 10 students, an A and a B student, odds are you'll find that they have very similar, they'll get a very similar grade. The A student actually won't necessarily beat the B student on the first reading of a book, of a chapter. Where the A student shines, however, is if you ask them, what is it that you don't know? What did you not understand, right? The A student has a pretty good idea of what he doesn't understand, okay, or she. And that makes a lot of sense, because how do we improve ourselves? How do we come to understand things better? It's not by focusing on, hey, man, this is the stuff I really got figured out, right? It's by focusing on what you don't understand, right? So if you look at the Kindle, where's the tool for designating a piece of text as a knowledge gap? Doesn't exist, right? So those tools aren't currently available, but there's ways of using, say, Skim to do that kind of thing, right? And that's, for knowledge workers, that's very important. It's also important for students.
That's fascinating. Yeah, it reminds me of Socrates.
Yes.
Yeah, the wisest man because he's aware of his own limits.
That's right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Is there actually, so on the subject of Leanpub, just now that we're nearing the end of the interview, can you just tell me generally what your experience was like using Leanpub, and if there's anything we can do to improve it overall?
I've really enjoyed using Leanpub. I had written my first draft, which is quite an extensive draft, using Scrivener, a tool that I really like. But then I realized I want to do Leanpub. Well, I had realized halfway that I really want to use Leanpub. I had not used Markdown extensively before, so I needed to convert the content from Scrivener to Markdown. And Scrivener's got a tool to generate Markdown, but I couldn't work with that Markdown. That didn't work for me. So I think I ended up doing an HTML export, and your tool managed to import quite well. I was really surprised. And at first I thought, well, this is not going to be much work. But actually it ended up taking me several weeks to do it. But you know what? It was a big book. Now, the Leanpub way of doing it is you start with Leanpub. So for an author who's starting in Leanpub, he doesn't face that in Markdown. Doesn't face that problem, right?
Yeah.
I had huge. This is not a small book, you know. Mm-hmm. So I had a lot of content, but I did reserve some. Like there's a chapter that I'm working on from scratch on the Leanpub platform. So that's the deliberate practice chapter is not complete. That's chapter 7 and the conclusion. So because I want to go through that experience of really adding new content with Leanpub. So what can I say? I mean, just generally, I can point to the fact that was not as easy as I hoped it would be. But okay, so now in terms of other things that I would like to see in Leanpub, right now, for some reason, I'm drawing a blank. Well, I mean, I had proposed certain things. You know, I had proposed certain things. I'd like to see something like I'd like to see Leanpub. I'd like there to be a good PDF, an even better PDF reader. And I thought, well, this would fit so naturally with Leanpub, but that is not really targeted at authors. That's more targeted at readers. And I realized that Leanpub is really focused right now on supporting, you know, getting authors to get their content out.
That's true. Although we're now expanding our focus a little bit to be more reader centric.
Okay.
So sort of the next stage in the evolution of Leanpub, and in particular, we see the relationship. The idea of in progress publishing like this is relatively new, and it's a way of potentially establishing a new kind of relationship between authors and readers.
Yes.
Where it's you know, like authors and readers have always communicated with each other, but not as it were in real time on the subject of an evolving book.
Right.
I would, so maybe that might. Is there anything along those lines maybe that you'd like to suggest?
Think of. Well, here's one thing. Okay, one thing is, and we'll come back to that particular aspect. But before I forget, the other thing is that as an author, I keep track of my release notes, but I haven't actually published them yet. I published them once, but I didn't like the structure, so I'm gonna come back and let people know what's changed between revisions. Now, O'Reilly, as you know, has this feature where I don't know how they do it, but this must be software driven. It is O'Reilly after all, right? Where the author basically in a systematic fashion is able to indicate what's changed in each revision. So right now, if as an author, when I publish a new revision, I have the choice of emailing all my readers at once, which I don't like to do. You wouldn't want me to do that either. You know, I've already got, I think, over 60, maybe over 70 releases, I think, of my book. Yeah, because I love this idea. I embrace Lean. Talk about it in my book. How do you learn Lean? I think it's great. So although I did a big bang kind of integration with my first, conversion into Leanpub, but since then I've been just doing these minor modifications as I go along. Why not? Just press. I find a typo. Why should I wait? Just press the publish button, right? Or more significant changes. I've done all kinds of changes already, but I'd like to systematically be able to indicate the problems to my reader. So I'd like to have a form or a spread, even better in Markdown or a spreadsheet or something, a tab delimited file or something where I can say, okay, chapter, page number, original text, new text, description of change, attribution, to thank whoever found the error. Something like that would be cool.
Attribution, that's a very interesting idea. It would encourage people to respond and give them some positive feedback or positive sense of participation in the project.
Yeah, and then readers could go and they'd have access to this release note on the website. They can see what's changed. Then you can get a sense of the book that, well, look, this is evolving. You can look at the velocity of change. You can, it's kind of cool. And I'm sure you've got all these data in your Git. So there's endless possibilities, even scientifically, for you with all your data. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is maybe getting back to your reader concern is helping my readers who would adopt the ways of working with, say, PDF and other formats, right, that I propose, is that, so say a user marks up a document in using Skim, which is a PDF reader. So he marks up a book, my book, say, okay? He finds several key ideas, marks them up, okay? And then I come out with a new revision, and then what? Well, his annotations are now lost. So here Kindle wins, because Kindle wins. Kindle, I don't know how Kindle handles updates, but, presumably they try to anchor and readjust the annotations, right? So a framework like Digo, for instance, does that all the time. If the web page, Digo is a web annotation tool. So you can go to a web page and highlight or add notes. And if that web page changes, then Digo's got some logic to try to make a best guess at where the annotation should be anchored, okay? I've developed tools with Teams software developer previously to do this kind of thing with web content. So right now, the PDF readers such as Skim, they're not set up for this. But, if you want to get into that, then you could, and I think it would be very important for this tool to be available. Yeah.
So what you would like to see perhaps from us is something perhaps of a metadata kind that an external app designed for annotating could then use in order to do things like appropriately anchor a note in a section that's actually been deleted or something like that.
That's one way to do it. You could provide the meta. You could perhaps provide the metadata. That would be one approach. I mean, the other approach is basically to collaborate in some other way with a small business that's developing an enhanced PDF reader that would handle this aspect and maybe other problems, basically. So the problem of updating, basically, what's the big picture is to allow a PDF reader to continue to delve an evolving document. Now, delve to me means actively read in this context.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there anything we could do to help you discover more readers or help readers discover you that occurred to you as you were launching your book and starting to tell people about it?
Okay, so I don't necessarily have solutions, but I know I'm acutely aware of the problem, right? That is an issue, right? But I'm sure it's one that's going to be solved. So there is, I thought, well, maybe connect is one thing that could be done is more on the service side, is maybe connecting, having, service providers like editors or book marketers or whatever who've you vetted in some way, that would help in the book marketing perspective process.
Okay, so like Leanpub approved kind of cover designers and things like that.
Right. Yeah, and on their site, and even on your site, or it could be some. I don't know how integrated you want to do it, but something in that direction. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's very practical.
Suggestion. I must say, okay, I'm very, I'm just very happy. I'm really pleased with Leanpub. I've recommended it to other authors, and I've had a great experience with it. And for instance, the bibliography thing we talked about, Leanpub for academics, and the bibliographies weren't being formatted properly because Markdown doesn't handle that. And within a couple of emails, the feature was implemented, and then all of a sudden, bang! My glossaries and my bibliographies are up to standard that they'd be if I was publishing this with anybody else.
Oh, that was hanging indents, I think, that Scott.
Hanging indents, yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, I guess my thanks for all the positive comments and suggestions. I have one last question. I guess is
sure.
Are you writing? Are you planning on writing another book or?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got quite ambitious actually.
Okay.
There's a follow up to this one which would be focusing more on the practical stuff. So taking basically ideas from chapter 3 and representing them and extending them. For minus the science. So
so the techniques and tools. Yeah.
So there's that. I've got we've got sleep products coming out, and there's a need for a book on sleep, specifically on sleep acceleration, sleep onset acceleration. So things like that. So I think I will write more with co-authors, perhaps.
Great.
Forward.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to reading the full article on how to fall asleep. Because, yeah, that's very, very good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Luc, for being on the Lean Publishing podcast and for being a Leanpub author.
Thank you very much, and we'll be in touch.
Okay.